Hello and welcome to Streamers and Punches, the podcast from Sound Ocean TV that looks at current events and new releases in the world of film music. My name is Bill Witham.
And I'm Kevin Wilt.
And on today's show, we're going to look at a couple different summer movies that have come out recently since our last podcast. That being Brave, with the score by Patrick Doyle, and The Amazing Spider-Man, with the score by James Horner. Before we get into that, we want to look at a couple of headlines we've got going on. Not too much happening, I guess I'm glad to say. First off, something that is...
Yeah, I think we're at that time of year when movies are actually coming out and we can now hear scores. So the kind of news is over, and it's, you know what I mean?
Yep. First up, there's an article that NPR had recently, kind of interesting. It's talking about like what in music actually scares us, and a lot about what they touch upon is very much one of the tools that a lot of film composers use in their toolbox whenever they score a new film. And it talks about the science of acoustics and how, to paraphrase some of the science in the article, when you set up a regular pattern and then we can kind of latch on and understand the pattern and comprehend it, whether it be just a series of sounds or straight ahead music, the way we've become used to, once you disrupt that pattern, all of a sudden it sort of sends us on a kind of an alert, or sort of sets off a red flag for us. And it starts there, and I won't describe any more of the article. If you're interested in that, definitely check it out. So the link to that will be at our website, soundnotion.tv, soundnotion.tv/SAP.
It is interesting.
What's that?
It is interesting, that idea. It's something we've actually talked about on the show before, this idea of having a pattern like an ostinato or a drone or something like that. And you're right, and the point that's made is that when you set up something to create that kind of comfort level and then you disrupt it, it creates a sense of unease in the listener. But it's something we've discussed before, that we almost see the opposite thing in a lot of scores nowadays, that composers using drones and ostinato patterns as them in and of themselves, not interrupted, but being preserved as a way of creating tension. Drones in particular, that in intense, scary scenes, a lot of composers nowadays score with a long drone, and as opposed to having a drone that is interrupted and using the interruption to create intensity, they're using just the drone in and of itself in intensity. So it's an interesting point that we've kind of run into before. It's definitely worth checking out the article to look at it further.
Yeah. Okay, so the link's at our website. Next up, Gustavo Dudamel, the new Venezuelan conductor of the Los Angeles Philharmonic. What is he, 35 years old?
No, he's, I think, maybe 31 or 32, maybe.
Okay. So he's pretty young. Kevin, you ran across this. Tell us about The Liberator.
Yeah, there's a biopic being filmed in South America called The Liberator. It's a biopic of Simón Bolívar. And so Gustavo Dudamel, very, very famous Venezuelan conductor, has been hired to compose the score to this film. Now, I know he's composed some things before. I believe this may be his first film score, though. So I think it'll be very interesting to hear how this turns out. I wonder, he's associated with several different orchestras, like you said, the LA Philharmonic or the Simón Bolívar Youth Orchestra in Venezuela. It'll be interesting. I'm wondering if one of those orchestras will be used to record the score, or how that'll work out. It'll be interesting to see how this project turns out.
All right. Next up, I found an article. Is kind of interesting, albeit a little bit opinionated and one-sided, but so is our show sometimes. So there you go. But it's called "The 6 Most Painful Film Scores of All Time." not trying to just put that out there like the 6 most painful scores of like this week, but of all time.
Yeah, it's
basically
not a place you want to find yourself.
Yeah, there's the author is a guy named William Bigelow, and he basically just wants to tell you about six scores that he really hates. A couple movies I hadn't even heard of, to be honest, and I watch a lot of movies, so that shows maybe either he's more of a film buff than I am, or whatever. But a couple points I think he makes are not bad. He really well, I don't want to list all six, but he starts off with Chariots of Fire and talks about how there's a sort of a disconnect between watching men run in slow motion in the 1924 Olympics
1920s, yeah,
and being supplied musically by synthesizers, and how that's a little bit of a disconnect with time period and the technology. And I do agree with that. I think he's got a solid point there. And he says that he considers the melody by Vangelis, which is basically elevator music and a household tune at this point that everybody knows.
Yeah.
The theme to Chariots of Fire, anyway.
And that's part of the issue, I think. I think that's part of the issue is that music, it's written in such a way that it's almost instant cliche. And it's really tough to do anything with it if that's where it's starting. So, yeah, that when I saw that on the list, and it's number 6 on the list, it was kind of a no explanation. I got it. I understand. That makes sense.
So anyway, it's kind of a fun list. Not anything, profound, but just kind of like one guy's rant. And if you have been itching to see someone else say something bad about the Social Network score, then you're in luck. So check out that article. You'll have a good read.
The one on the list that kind of made my day was The Princess Bride. It's a really great movie. It's very funny, but the score it uses what sounds like some of the earliest synthesizer and sampling technology available, and it's this one, of the scores that I've heard on this list, the word painful I think is applied best to this, because there are great moments in the film when it's just all of a sudden there's this terribly cheap sounding synthesizer music that you think, it's this really clever writing and some pretty great performances. And then there's just this music that just seems so completely disconnected with the quality level. It's painful is a good word to describe it. So I kind of chuckled when that one was on the list, because that was another one that I know exactly what the guy is talking about.
Okay. All right, so check that out, the 6 most painful film scores of all time. Daniel Schweiger has an interview with Patrick Doyle, the composer of Brave, which was the Pixar movie that came out just a couple weeks ago. So Brave is their big movie for the summer. So you want to check that out, look for the link at our website. And then also The Dark Knight Rises, of course, everyone knows when that'll be out, July 20th. So just a little bit longer. We have to sort of wait until that movie opens. But
we should mention that, of course,
what's that?
Dark Knight Rises will be the topic for our next show, so stay tuned.
That's right. So we have, to spread it out, one comic book character per show. That's right. So this is going to be devoted mostly to Spider-Man, next time to Batman, and I couldn't be happier, so that's fine with me. But, yeah, so if you want to hear there's about 14 minutes of it available. We've got a link to it. That just goes to, YouTube, I believe.
Right.
Yeah, there's like a kind of
during our last show, we posted a link with a couple of short examples from the soundtrack, and since then there have been other websites that have popped up with more and more. This seems to be the biggest chunk available so far, and that this is like a 14-minute montage of music that is available in one YouTube video. So yeah, it's it is what it is. I personally I have seen a lot of the Dark Knight Rises things that have popped up on the internet, but with so little time now left to go before the movie, I'm personally putting myself in like isolation mode. So I haven't really listened to it much, and I don't really plan on listening to it much until I actually get to see the movie.
I will say there's about a 13-minute featurette, though, that just came out, and it was really cool. I saw it on, it's in YouTube, but the link I saw was at /film. We're not going to link it here just because it's for just the movie, so it's just interviews with Nolan. It's really easy to find online if you're interested in it. But the thing is, is that I was intentionally not. At first I wasn't going to look at it, but then I did, and it didn't spoil anything. It just got me really excited for The Dark Knight Rises, which, I mean, lately I had been kind of like, yeah, whatever. It's going to come out in a couple more weeks, and I'll go see it. Whoop-de-doo. But now I'm actually kind of pumped, and it worked. It worked on me exactly as it was supposed to, and I'm excited. I'm excited to see the new people in the movie, the Catwoman and Bane, and then I'm excited to see what Christian Bale's got in store. So yeah, looking forward to that definitely. Okay, so since we last had our show, since our last show, Kevin, what have you been listening to? Anything besides what we're going to cover?
Not really a whole lot. I mean, especially these two films have been the last, or I should say, Spider-Man and Brave have been the last two films I've seen in the theater. So that's kind of been the focus of my film music attention over the past couple weeks, more or less. I know you had mentioned that you recently purchased the discarded score of John Corigliano's score to The Edge of Darkness. Yeah. The Mel Gibson thriller came out about a year, maybe a year and a half ago.
Yeah.
I haven't listened to that yet. I know it's currently out of stock at Entrada, but can you tell us what you thought of that music?
Yeah, definitely. So I did. I just purchased it's called Music from the Edge, and they don't tell you in the booklet that it's the rejected score. Or Kevin, as you use the word discarded, in my mind I saw John Corigliano take his score and throw it in the trash because it's the discarded score. No, but yeah, he wrote the score to the film. It was supposed to be Mel Gibson's return to tight gripping dramas or whatever, and it didn't work. I don't think it was that successful in the box office, and I think at this point Mel Gibson's pretty much. I think he's box office poisoned. But anyway, that's another podcast.
Yeah. Well, my understanding at the time was it was supposed to be this edgy psychological type of film, which would make sense to have a score by John Corigliano.
Well, but
then Warner Brothers or some other bigger distribution company got a hold of it, said, we want to make this a cop drama, so they did a bunch of reshoots. And so now Corigliano's score just completely didn't fit the film, so then they hired Howard Shore to come in and...
Right, Howard Shore ended up actually scoring the finished film. I remember when we saw... It was either we saw Corigliano and he was talking about the score, or I read an interview with him. I thought, first of all, it was really irregular for a Mel Gibson movie to have a John Corigliano score. I mean, why would John Corigliano, who does kind of like these event films, like Revolution was sort of... I don't know. I still need to see it, but it was a one-off, a historical drama, costume drama with Al Pacino. Those don't happen every month. But Mel Gibson, disposable action thrillers, they do. They happen every month, and that's just like Hollywood junk. So to see that he was scoring that was a bit of a surprise. Of course, The Red Violin was definitely an event movie. They don't make Red Violins every month. But the other point I was trying to make is that. He had said that the original story was going to focus on Mel Gibson's character and his daughter, and there was sort of a lot of emphasis on the father-daughter relationship. And as they spoil in the trailer, she's killed, so he spends the rest of the movie trying to track down the killers and trying to get revenge. And Corigliano had said, so I was going to score the father-daughter relationship, and that was central to the movie, and that was what it was all sort of the backbone. And then he said, and then the studio got a hold of it and said, we need to amp up like the violence and the revenge aspect and everything else. And then he said at that point, it wasn't the movie I started with and I had no more interest in it. So to listen to the music, it does really focus. There's a really great clarinet idea, a melody at the beginning that is a little reminiscent of Bernstein, a little bit like Make Our Garden Grow from Candide, but not paraphrasing or not exactly the same. It just kind of has the same sort of feel and the same sort of melodic contour, phrasing. But it was nice. It's nice, and it seemed to really capture kind of a close-knit emotional center. And then when he brings in the effects, for those listeners that may not know, John Corigliano is a master of orchestral effects and really should probably write a book about all the effects he's used over the decades and how he notates them, because he's got quite a few
He's amassed quite the library of.
Yeah, he's quite the living composer encyclopedia of orchestral effects. He pretty much comes up with new ones with every project he works on, and then has to notate them very specially, and has to then work with the musicians in more rehearsals probably than they're normally used to get the effects just right. And then they become more or less standard to where you or I could write a piece and ask for that same effect. Hopefully it'd be with players that are familiar with those effects. But the point is that he knows his way around orchestral color writing, as well as all the sort of classic textures and the classic demands that are made of composers. And the score is really interesting, and it has, like I said, a lot of effects, a lot of melodic, sort of tonal, mixed with a very aggressive kind of atonal. Basically, what a score with a lot of variety would offer. So lots of color and everything else, and very interesting, and a little bit too interesting. I mean, it changes colors, it changes textures quite drastically, and I can see why a lot of producers in Hollywood would be very afraid of using that score, because it commanded a lot of attention.
Yeah.
Instead of played in the background. So congrats, Corigliano, for being able to release the album of music, and the perfect.
It is nice that this music only took a couple of years to get out, and not the 30 years that it took the music from Revolution, because that came out, I think, just 2 or 3 years ago, but that's a film from the early 1980s.
Right.
So it's nice that it's available. I know it's conducted by our local orchestra music director, Leonard Slatkin.
So
that's right. So like I said, I would like to order it, but it's currently out of stock. So I think I'm just gonna have to mooch off your copy until it's available.
Yeah, it should probably be back in stock pretty soon.
Yeah.
And you can definitely check that out. We'll probably, I haven't had a chance to dig up a few of the titles. I'll prepare some for our next show. We'll talk about like all the releases that have come out lately. There's been a couple more Goldsmith. Yeah. But definitely, if you haven't got Star Trek: The Motion Picture, which we mentioned last time, you should, because it's awesome. I finally got mine, and it was great. It sounds fantastic.
It's been a fantastic listen. There are some great tracks of like raw takes from the studio, and you hear mistakes, and it's amazing that with just hearing like the overture sight read, or the main title sight read, just how good it sounds just right off the bat without any polish. So there are a lot of I guess you may call them bonus track types of things on it that are kind of, it's worth buying it almost just for those.
Yeah. All right, and then very quickly, I was perusing Netflix, the Netflix Instant recently, and I saw that they had Transformers Dark of the Moon, otherwise known as Transformers 3, and I decided to watch it as though I had lost a bet. And I watched it, and it was as though
you had watched the whole thing, right?
Or I was taking one for the team. Really bad movie, with every choice that a filmmaker can make to choose the bad option of one or two possible ways to execute a scene. It's as though Michael Bay chose the bad option every single time.
It's like a choose your own adventure, except you make the wrong choice every single time you have a choice to make.
Well, at least there you can change things. In this one, it seemed like it was just badly written from the start to finish. But anyway, Steve Jablonsky, who scored the first and the second, also scored this one. And it was very forgettable, just running strings all throughout the whole thing, and lots of pointless conversation. So you have to keep the strings running where they're turned down underneath all this phony, intense conversation about phony science and phony drama. That's supposedly got the the Earth, the fate of the Earth is in their hands. And then he brought back the theme once or twice from the very first Transformers movie. I was at least listening for that to see if he did anything with it, and I heard just a couple like augmented versions where it's just played out with longer notes, and that was about it. Pretty forgettable. So Speaking of forgettable, let's move right along to the main topic of this week. We'll talk about Spider-Man, because honestly, I probably have more opinions about that than Brave. But so let's see. We both saw Spider-Man, or The Amazing Spider-Man, this week. Directed by Mark Webb, starring all new cast of characters, rebooting the whole franchise. And the music this time, instead of being by Danny Elfman or Christopher Young in the third one, was by James Horner. A composer, as we'll point out later, has done superhero movies before with The Rocketeer. He did that.
It's been a while. I mean, were you surprised to learn that James Horner was going to be scoring this film?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
Yeah,
me too.
because it's like he's been around this whole time, and the only one who still uses them is James Cameron. So
Right.
he'd come out of hiding and do the Avatar, and then it was not that great of a score. I just thought it was a rehash of many other elements he'd done before for Cameron and for other people. And then he would sort of go back into hiding and or hiding. I don't know what he does in his spare time. Maybe he's a philanthropist or something. But he did this, and I actually found some parts of it really attractive. Like, hey, that sounds like Horner, but then this part doesn't sound like Horner. So this is kind of a nice combination. I tell you what, before we get too in depth, why don't we just play the opening main titles? Kev, why don't we do that?
Sure.
Okay, so here's about the first minute and 20 seconds of the main titles to The Amazing Spider-Man by James Horner. I'll start and see if you've got any thoughts you just want to put out there about the Spider-Man, like the theme, the use of colors, anything.
The use of color, that's an interesting question.
Or did you like it?
Well, I mean, it was. I kind of liked it. It was. I had some issues with it that I think we'll get into. Because it's James Horner and perhaps not a younger composer, it did a lot of more. I felt it did a lot more like classically orchestral things, as opposed to more a more contemporary, layered sort of sounding score. I mean, there are moments when you're hearing different instrumental families and combinations, which a lot of times nowadays you're just hearing big, heavy orchestra sound. And that big, weighty orchestra and percussion type of thing, more of like a Hans Zimmer style score, is kind of what I was expecting for this film. And that's not really what we got. And that I thought was kind of nice.
Yeah.
A lot of the critical reviews of this film, I've noticed, have commented on the Horner score that it was too loud. A lot of people said the music in this film was too loud. Personally, I didn't think it was too loud. There was a lot of music. You and I kind of discussed it's
wall to wall.
There are very few scenes where there's not music.
Can you hear this? Can you hear my keyboard? Can you hear that? I noticed about every moment that Andrew Garfield was on screen looking for something because his parents were gone and he always wondered where they were. You kept getting that. It was almost always in the background. Like every time something was sort of
there's always
going to develop into some kind of mystery or some sort of plot. That was the untold.
There was always something there. Yeah. My thought on it, I don't know that I would go as far to say that the score was too loud. Something that kind of struck me about the score is maybe it wasn't too loud, but I think it was maybe a bit too full. And what I mean by that is to me, the score seemed like it was trying to be two different scores at the same time. You have like the traditional James Horner orchestral type of writing, But then on top of that, you have layers of a more contemporary synth, drone, ambient type of score. And I feel like either of those things by themselves would have maybe been a better balance of music for the film. But trying to have the score be both of those things at the same time, maybe the overall sound was too full and just too thick and could come across as too loud. I think that's more how it struck me as opposed to just being the volume turned up too much, you know.
Well, no, I agree with that. I think it did feel at odds a little bit. Like there was a kind of a traditional Horner approach of big orchestra. And Horner, generally, when he writes for a large Hollywood movie like Star Trek or Willow or The Rocketeer, which we'll compare a little bit to in a moment, he usually has a very big sound. Like his orchestration guys are busy because they've made the entire orchestra active and they're all part of it. So there was a little bit of a feeling like it's at odds with this kind of modern day sensibility. Like I'm James Horner, so I can write for the full orchestra, but now because it's 2012, I've got to include like these sort of percussion layers and loops, and it's got to have
more sleek ambient types of things. Yeah,
it's got to have these little like fast moving rhythms in the back, which actually there is a kind of a programmatic feeling. Like John Williams uses this all the time, where you have very quick rhythms happening in the background, and then like these long line melodies happening very legato or very smoothly. It signifies flight, and with Spider-Man, I took it to mean it signified him swinging around New York all the time, especially the big montage near the end. Not montage, but let's just say the use of cranes at the near the climax of the movie. But there are a lot of little moments that are what we just said, which are these sort of two worlds, and he's trying to reconcile the difference. But also I noticed there's just a lot of what I call Hornerisms, where he sort of has his way of either developing a theme by kind of just breaking it up into repeating small parts of it, or he brings in this chord progression that he started way back with Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, and he uses it Star Trek 3, and then he uses it in, I think, in Willow a little bit, definitely in The Rocketeer, and it becomes kind of like his superhero crescendo or something, if you will. So I kind of prepared like a little stream of some Hornerisms. So I want to check some of those out now, because you'll definitely hear with the brass superhero chord progression crescendo, that's as much a Hornerism as anything else he's done that I just described. You'll hear that at the end. So let's check that out now. There's a couple little clips put together. So yeah, part of me was like, "Oh, it's old James Horner. He's come back to score a superhero movie."
Yeah, you and I saw the film together, and we both kind of giggled at that moment when we heard that little triplet brass progression there. Now, I feel like anytime anyone discusses James Horner, they have to talk about how much he steals from himself or other composers, and that's kind of what we're doing now. Do you think it's justified? Because to some extent, I feel like we could have that conversation with most film composers.
Yeah,
James Horner is just the one that we pick on the most with regard to that kind of thing.
Well, he used to be picked on until Hans Zimmer's trove of composers became employed by like every cheap studio in Hollywood. and all of a sudden, then that sound of like horns and strings and taiko drums was synonymous with about every thriller and every action movie you got. And then it became, well, James Horner's not so bad because everything else is really lazy. It's a very, very sort of carbon copy of each other, and and using a very sort of narrow-minded approach to color and orchestration. It tends to be just, rhythm with some strings, and how much more propulsive can we get than the next guy? Now that we come back to Horner, I just feel more lenient in a sense, because it's like, yeah, there's a couple, like I said, a couple Hornerisms where he's borrowing from himself.
Yeah.
I just don't care anymore. I mean, in a couple spots, it juiced up the scene, and it was familiar for me as a composer who's heard his scores before, but it kind of brought a smile to my face, and I didn't feel that I hate him because...
I can't have that same reaction. It's there are certain things that Horner, maybe more so than other composers, is going to repeat, but I feel like I'm at a point where I'm okay with that. And if they work well in the film, which most of the time in this film they did,
right,
then great.
Right, and that was exciting when the brass build up, because it's when Spider-Man's in that point of view shot, and that they used in the trailer, and he jumps across the building and then lands like on the glass, and you actually, for the first time, get to see Spider-Man like through his eyes. And I thought that was cool, but it was just a little fun moment, and meant to be like an establishing, like, okay, now Spider-Man is here, and he's got the outfit, and he's ready to like fight crime. So on with the movie, and it's kind of served like a little boost, and I enjoyed that.
Yeah. I mean, and like I said, those type of moments, as even though we maybe heard them in other Horner scores, I thought they generally worked well. Dramatically, it seemed like the score fit the film pretty well. There were a couple of moments in some particularly tense spots when there were just a couple of musical choices that, instead of trying to highlight or amp up the tension, they almost cut it right down and almost brought like a smile to your face in a bad way. So there were a handful of moments that dramatically I didn't think it worked very well.
Was that the Jurassic Park moment?
It was yeah, we'll call it the Jurassic Park moment. And for those of you that have seen the film, you probably know exactly what moment we're talking about. Takes place in the lab, and Gwen Stacy is trying to hide, and it seemed like one of those moments that musically, could have been less is more, and there was just a little too much for it to qualify as less is more. It's overall, like, again, my biggest issue with the score was it seemed like it was trying to be a big adventurous James Horner orchestral score and kind of a sleek contemporary action score at the same time, and it just seemed like there were a lot of times when that didn't mesh very well. I would have preferred it leaning in one direction or the other. The one thing I did find interesting, and it kind of goes back to something you were talking about a few minutes ago, of having these very active rhythmic accompaniments. And that's something the thing I found interesting, that was something that I found that Danny Elfman did in his Spider-Man scores a lot too. A lot of very soft background rhythmic things to kind of highlight the sort of, squirmy nature of Spider-Man crawling around all over the place and swinging through the city. So
I always just thought Elfman did that because he always likes lots of percussion in the scores, because that was actually one of the most obtrusive sounding things if you ever go back to that Spider-Man main title. Yeah. And he has like these really high strings, and then all of a sudden he has this like mid-range conga or something come in with this like, and I always thought it's just sticking out, like it doesn't even sound like he tried to mix it. And I thought, this is, boys and girls, why you don't make electronic music in your studio and you let the orchestra musicians play it, because they'll make it sound good. But anyway, that's another show.
But I will say, 10 years ago when that first Spider-Man movie came out, a lot of people complained that Danny Elfman didn't give Spider-Man a big heroic theme. And it's there. It's just kind of buried. It's a slower thing buried underneath some faster things. It was interesting hearing that complaint 10 years ago, and then now we get the James Horner Spider-Man theme, which is maybe there's maybe more to it than the Danny Elfman theme, but I found it was significantly less memorable than the Danny Elfman theme. So it's interesting that 10 years ago people are complaining that we don't get a good Spider-Man theme with Danny Elfman, and now 10 years later, it seems like we've gotten even less of one with James Horner.
Well, there's more music that's present, and there's more sort of motivic use. But I would say that the movie itself is not as sort of warm and emotional as the Raimi. I mean, he borderlined on having Peter Parker like crying every 45 minutes in the film. I mean, it was like This is like the John Boehner version of Peter Parker or something. I don't. And in this movie, it's not warm. I mean, it's not an emotional movie in that sense. It has emotional moments, but I found it not as impactful overall. And so the music kind of went along with that, and it tried to add emotional elements where it could, but sometimes it was the movie itself that just couldn't provide it. So the music was doing the heavy lifting and not able to finally do it all. But overall, yeah, I mean. I enjoyed the score, and it very much played out like an opera. Lots of music throughout lots of scenes, and you definitely hear it. And those are the things that we basically bitch about. Like, we don't get those anymore. So I enjoyed that those were all there, and it was a big summer blockbuster, and it was like a return in some sorts. James Horner, big summer movie, superhero with lots of color, lots of orchestra, and so I enjoyed that. Yeah. We also saw Brave.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we did. Yeah, there's not much else to talk about. I mean, the one thing to kind of discuss about the score to Brave, the movie was really lackluster, and the score was kind of right there with it. My big thing is that it's of course a film about a Scottish character.
Yeah.
Most of the actors are Scottish
with lots of red hair.
With lots of flowing red hair, yeah.
The red hair deserves its own credit in the movie, by the way, because
it's pretty really fantastic looking red hair. I mean,
the red hair looked really good.
It's an animation challenge in and of itself.
Yeah, the red hair was awesome. But the movie,
I thought I read somewhere that the red hair had like 100,000 moving components to be animated, which wouldn't surprise me.
The red hair was very expensive.
Right, very expensive red hair. So anyway, so Scottish movie, Scottish actors, and of course they hire, I think, arguably the most famous Scottish film composer around today, and that's Patrick Doyle, which I think was a perfectly logical move, made lots of sense. But the score that I felt we end up with, it seemed to be as generically Scottish as you would get from any other Hollywood composer if you ask them to write a score to a Scottish themed film. I mean, you have kind of your very sort of...
Let's name some, off the top of our head, right? Okay, you've got, although it's Irish and not Scottish, you've got Far and Away by John Williams, and he uses the Chieftains as his little sort of in-house diegetic music band to sort of sound really authentic. And they're an authentic Irish group. There's Braveheart, also by James Horner.
Yeah, of course.
Right.
Which he lots of use of bagpipes, of course, in that score.
Yeah, yep. Bagpipes, and then the whistles and the Uilleann pipes as well.
Yep.
Then this score uses a lot of... I don't remember seeing bagpipes in the credits, but I mean, there's a couple scenes where it's obviously bagpipes.
There were, and then some Celtic fiddles and flutes and harps and things like that. Yeah.
There's a lot of what they call the Uilleann pipes as well. Quick little aside. I was reading an article that said Uilleann pipes are in B flat, and they're pretty flexible musically, so you can write for them, and they have a pretty wide range, and they are more or less, you can kind of emote on them to some degree. Whereas bagpipes, a little bit trickier to do that with. You basically have to set up the drone, play really loudly, and then call it a day. So often, especially in the James Horner soundtrack to Braveheart, you got a lot of Uilleann pipes that people ended up thinking were bagpipes.
Right.
And it sort of was like a Hollywood fake out. It was like a doubling or a replacement rather, for added flexibility. But anyway, I was just going to say one more list might be the Water Horse. What was that? Legend of the Deep or something like that by James Newton Howard.
Yeah.
Also, I think used the Chieftains. and takes place in Scotland. Deals with, of course, the Loch Ness monster, and yeah. So anyway, all these movies kind of have this. We were noticing a generic Scottish sound, and I didn't really think
Hollywood orchestra.
Yeah,
largely strings with a couple of authentic instruments sprinkled on top. And that's essentially what we get from Patrick Doyle here. And that's what I found disappointing. Is I mean,
there were no running strings from Thor, but there wasn't.
Right.
But there wasn't going to be.
Right. I was expecting something sounding a little less Hollywood commercial and more authentic, folky sounding, because that's very much where the movie lives. Is kind of this Scottish element.
Yeah, I mean, Pixar would be the company to get away with something like that. But
exactly.
If anybody's seen the movie, they realize that it's mainly really like a Disney princess movie that just got animated really well by Pixar. But when you watch it, you realize there's like a sort of a thin story on the surface. Or let me watch out for my name there. A thin story on the surface, and then there's not much underneath it. There's no real weight or gravitas.
It's not the weight you get from other Pixar films. That's true.
Yeah. The movie's over pretty quickly, and you kind of wishing it was over sooner. But anyway, there's a lot of songs, just like most Disney princess movies, and I didn't feel like they added anything. They were actually kind of, Well, I'm sort of paraphrasing some other critics, but they had said they were awkwardly placed throughout the movie. Once or twice was okay, but a couple times the movie gets going and you just really need propulsive music, and you get another song. And I would agree with that.
I'm wondering if we would have gotten a better Patrick Doyle Scottish score had it been to a better movie.
That's entirely possible. Yeah, I kind of think we would have. Yeah. Now there were a couple scenes that I did like. They were very, very small, subtle passages. But when the will-o-wisps appear, the little blue, they're like little blue flame creatures that sort of appear and then disappear playfully throughout the forest.
Propane flames.
Yeah. Right. There was sort of just these sort of very kind of random little triads he brought in with the strings, and they would just kind of do like little swells, and they'd kind of be in and then out. And I like that. I thought there was something really kind of ethereal about what he was doing there. And for once, especially being Patrick Doyle, it wasn't like a wall-to-wall, like here's my long melody, or here's my drone, or here's my drum beat that I'm setting up with my string arpeggios above it. It was this little, like these little touches of musical color. Right. And I liked it, and I thought that kind of made me take notice, which is what I take to mean that it was a well-scored scene. But other than that, I can't say there were too many passages that were memorable at all. So, yeah, that was Brave for me. Not real memorable in the end.
Yeah.
All right. Okay. So. All done with Brave.
I think that'll do it for Brave. I think that'll do it for today's show, Bill.
Okay. Hey, why don't we end on Rocketeer and save?
Yeah.
Save. Okay.
Exactly. A couple minutes ago, in talking about James Horner, we listened to what you referred to, I think, as some James Horner-isms, some things that he likes to do in his score. And there was the one that we mentioned that we kind of chuckled about in Spider-Man, and we found essentially the same exact technique in Rocketeer. Part of me thinks it works a little bit better in Rocketeer, but I think maybe I'm just partial to that score. So I think we're gonna listen to that as we wrap up today's show.
Sure. All right. So that will do it for this episode of Streamers and Punches. As always, you can listen to us on soundnotion.tv/SAP, where you can subscribe to our show, leave comments, and find links to the music we spoke about. You can also subscribe to the show through iTunes. My name is Bill Witham.
And I am Kevin Wilt.
And we'll leave you with, I believe it's Rocketeer to the Rescue and end credits.
Rescue, that's right.
From the movie Rocketeer, also by James Horner. Have a great week. Thank you for listening. We'll see you next time.